they're upset about is the number of guns in the country. This isn't about, modest age restrictions that are unconstitutional. It's not about better record keeping. They want fewer guns. They think that the answer is fewer guns. And that is what is creating a lot of discomfort among our fellow Americans who cherish their guns and cherish their Second Amendment rights and have actually committed no crimes.
They cherish their children, Mr. Gaetz?
You know what? Their children aren't the ones at risk as a consequence of law-abiding gun owners.
All children in America are at risk.
That's what you get wrong. It's not law-abiding gun owners, David. Okay.
Were those children in Uvalde at risk?
Here's the tension. Here's the tension, okay? You guys are spasming into this reflexive response, and you call it an emergency hearing, right? And the basis for the emergency is what happened in Uvalde. And we all agree it was awful and tragic, but you are not providing the thoughtful solutions that would actually reduce the likelihood of that. When you make an argument in the Judiciary Committee for a change in the law, there are two components. You have to demonstrate a need for the change, and that what you're bringing forward will actually affect that in a positive way. And it's the second part of the argument where the bills you've presented today undeniably fail. And in Florida, I would suggest we had a process that's a little bit better than what we've observed here. In Florida, following Parkland, every Floridian wanted to reduce the likelihood that that could ever occur again for precisely the reasons that animate your passions today. But instead of rushing to town, stumbling bills together, we got our very best sheriffs, our very best police chiefs, former members of law enforcement, people with tactical experience, even parents of slain children. And we put them on a board to review a school shooting as if it were an airline crash, dispassionately, thoroughly. And then as a consequence, what we saw was actually a failure in law enforcement. That the sheriff in Broward County was so recalcitrant in not doing the training, that the on-the-ground law enforcement were so derelict in their duties that children died that didn't need to. And so Governor DeSantis rightly fired that sheriff, replaced them, put better training in, more money to harden our schools and our synagogues, our houses of worship across the state of Florida, and we're safer as a consequence. So it's not that we're particularly here to talk about abortion or the border. We understand we have to make these things less likely, but whether it's you holding an emergency hearing to respond to a leaked draft opinion that's not even final, or now when the Congressman Roy from Texas says, gosh, before you have the emergency Uvalde hearing, maybe we ought to figure out what happened in Uvalde so that we can make that frequency less likely to occur. I think there's also a balancing of interests here that the American people need to understand. You say if it saves one life, anything that saves one life is totally worth doing. And certainly every loss of life is tragic, and certainly every preventable loss of life is tragic. But Mr. Cohen gave up the game earlier when he said, we acknowledge on the front end of this hearing that there will be deprivations of liberty to law-abiding people, that we will at times stop law-abiding people from doing what is otherwise constitutionally legal. So while I certainly want every American to safely store their firearms, while I certainly want every American to be trained on the safe storage of firearms, I'm not entirely sure that the Congress of the United States is the appropriate entity to tell Americans how to store firearms and then punish them as a consequence. And if the result of all of this is there's a a life or two that we save, and the result is, like, how many tens of millions of Americans are you willing to deprive of their constitutionally guaranteed liberty in order to achieve that objective, when there might be a more narrowly constrained appropriate way for gun enthusiast groups, hunting clubs, local government, states, to try to educate and encourage proper safety of the storage of firearms. So again, we share your goal of making these shootings less likely, whether they be in our schools or elsewhere in our communities, but we don't think that in the name of saving one life, that fundamentally constraining the rights of all Americans is necessary, especially when we are still awaiting the results of the review of what happened in Uvalde that shocks the conscience of all of us. So please spare us the spirited screaming. We want to stop the violence. We just wish you would listen to some of the ideas that we think would help. And from my standpoint, if you hold schools out as gun-free zones, as soft targets, you make those school shootings more likely. And I don't think you want to do that, But I think that if we got rid of the gun-free zones and if we empowered people that could be helpful, we might see a reduction in violence. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? The gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Move to strike, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
The gentleman from Florida said that he and his Republican colleagues want to stop the violence in this country. But it's difficult to believe that when there are common sense steps that Congress can take and they are unanimously obstructing those approaches. I want to elaborate something that my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, said earlier today, because it is clear to me that the more my colleagues misinterpret the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court's decision in D.C. versus Heller, the more they are giving up the fact that they've not actually read those documents. Let's start with the Second Amendment. The text is clear. The amendment protects the collective right of the people as a whole to possess arms solely for the purpose of forming a well-regulated militia. Now, last time I checked, the National Guard doesn't depend on teenage boys owning semi-automatic rifles with high-capacity magazines. Notice that while the Second Amendment is explicit that the government has the authority to regulate the use of arms, the Second Amendment does not include a single word, not one word, about an individual right to own a gun. In fact, the claim that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun is so indefensible that even the conservative former Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, no less, had once denounced it as, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public he had ever heard. No wonder the Supreme Court never recognized an individual right to own a gun from the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 until 2008, when the Roberts Court's far-right majority issued its 5-4 opinion in Heller. So let's talk about Heller. Yes, Heller did set a constitutional baseline that there is a right to own a handgun for self-defense in the home. But even in that egregiously mistaken decision, even in that decision, the court made clear that we can still regulate gun ownership and possession, particularly in sensitive places, as well as prohibit an individual from possessing firearms. As the late Justice Scalia's opinion explains, quote, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. And, quote, the right was not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. In fact, Justice Scalia went out of his way to emphasize that the sort of measures we are considering today would be plainly constitutional. He wrote, quote, nothing in our opinion, nothing should be taken to cast doubt on laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. And he continued that, quote, another important limitation on the right to keep and carry arms is that only, quote, the sorts of weapons protected were those in common use at the time. The Constitution does not condemn us to allow weapons of war to flood our neighborhoods. Make no mistake about that. My colleague's desperate citation to an outlier ruling by 2 Trump appointees in one circuit, and when have they ever been fans of the Ninth Circuit, as my colleague Mr. Neguse pointed out earlier, does not change the reality of what the Supreme Court has said. That is why even more circuits have upheld age restrictions on firearm purchases. The Fifth Circuit has twice upheld restrictions on particular weapons for 18 to 21-year-olds. The Supreme Court declined to weigh in both of those times, allowing the Fifth Circuit to be the final word in upholding these age restrictions. And the First and Seventh Circuits have upheld age restrictions as well. Activist, Trump-appointed judges may be trying to change settled law, just as they are trying to roll back decades of settled law upholding the right to an abortion. But don't believe the lie that they are selling, a lie so radical that even the far-right Roberts Court hasn't endorsed it. Age restrictions are nothing new, and they are consistent with the Second Amendment. So I've heard enough, and I think I speak for my Democratic colleagues when I say this, of ill-informed, bad faith constitutional misinterpretations. The Constitution is no obstacle to protecting our kids in America today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.